can we debate freedom of expression? This should be a very interesting panel. It's in sort of looking at the freedom to articulate culture, articulate artistic expression. And I hope, and I'm looking forward to it, of course, is we'll see an intellectual debate on the challenges, the issues, what might be impeding or liberating, expression on the arts, on culture. I think I'll just introduce the panelists. So, Tim Marlowe from the Royal Academy of the Arts will moderate this panel. Please kindly welcome Tim back to the floor. Thank you, Tim.
Thank you.
Thank you, of course. Again.
Can we debate freedom of expression? Well, obviously we can, because we're about to, but the question is how. And one of the extraordinary things about this summit is the range of people from different parts of the world and the quality of delegates. And there's a lot of quality in the room, but a lot of the delegates are not here who were here in the first 2 or 3 days. And what was interesting was there was a lot of people asking for a nuanced and complicated, or acknowledging the nuance and complexity of freedom of expression, who aren't able to be here now. And what this debate's not going to be, or what this discussion is not going to be, is an affirmation of Western liberal values in a preachy way across the world. That isn't universalism, it's just one particular view, which many of us hold dear, but applied across the world. But there is a question about whether there are certain universal values or universal moral codes that apply to the idea of freedom of expression, but also the whole idea about offence and our right to offend and our sensitivity often to take offence. And also the cultural responsibility of artists and institutions in this regard. Obviously underpinning it is the mediation, media, public, audiences. And I thought it was a very eloquent panel this morning that John Prideaux chaired that touched on some of these events. But we're sticking more specifically to artistic expression, but the artistic voice, which obviously has broader ramifications. Now, to discuss this with me, I'm joined by 3 panelists. Khalid Hourani, who is an artist and a writer and a curator based in Ramallah in the Palestinian territories, who set up, among other things, an academy for international art there. Monica Narula, who's an artist, philosopher, who's the co-founder of the Raqs Media Collective from Delhi. And Alexander Kellner, who's a paleontologist and the only panelist in the entire summit who's named 30 species, but is also director of the National Museum in Rio de Janeiro. Monica, I'd like to start with you, and actually, I don't want to give you the daunting task of framing the entire debate, but I would like to just ask you how you think it ought to be articulated. How might we articulate a debate around freedom of expression in the 21st century now, here?
Thank you, Tim. This is not a daunting task at all. But basically, I wanted to begin by talking about the other elephant, well, the elephant in the room, which is that, or when we talk about the freedom of expression, is that we normally mean freedom of speech. But freedom of speech I think of as a subset of the idea of freedom of expression, because freedom of speech is usually in relationship to the state or power, right? You have the right to freedom of speech, which is set up in the context of the society or governmentality that you're speaking in the context of. But freedom of expression is a much more human experience, right? We love, we create, even produce, because we have the capacity to express ourselves. The question, I think, is one of what are the thresholds that are permitted, right, or that we negotiate in our everyday experience. Talking of philosophy, Stanley Cavell has actually said that it is conversations, for example, in the house, and I think a lot of women here would agree with me, which are conversations between mothers and daughters, for example, that will determine what freedom, how freedom gets constituted or changed in other realms, right? Because what you read, what you eat, how you will engage with people, how you permit yourself to be touched, how will I live? These questions start from that context. So in a way, the conversations of the everyday start the framework for what expression is going to become or is going to mean. And these are choices, I think, that all of us begin from the most micro onwards. You know, I was reading that in Chiapas, women who, they don't have a word for right, for example, in their language. So they said, since we're going to change things around us, we're going to start using the phrase, the habit of being equal. So you can't give me the right to be equal, we will make it a habit of being equal. So in that sense, it starts from that point. And I just want to end by talking about a statement given to me once by a young woman in the Cyber Mohalla project that we were running in Delhi. And she's from a working class background, and we've been in dialogue actually over a number of years as the Cyber Mohalla ensemble in Sarai. And she said, you can have freedom of speech, but freedom of speech only makes sense when you have the freedom of listening. Parhesic speech or candid speech or speech that is arguing something is only valuable when someone is listening to it. So free speech is only as important as free listening. And I take that as a really important way of how we think of our practices as artists, but also as other cultural practitioners. How attentive are we to what is happening around us? Are we only paying attention to what an action is, that action of when we think we are being very active in the world, but are we also paying equal attention to the intention and the consequence that emerge from that? As a matter of fact, one of the pieces of work we made was called Utopia is a Hearing Aid.
That could be the theme of the next Culture Summit here, actually. But I think the idea of listening as well as speaking is critical, said the man who's moderated 4 panels and seems to do more speaking than anyone. Anyway, enough. Khalid, I really don't want to reductively position you in an over-binary situation. And coming from a country where binary opposition has completely ossified my nation at the moment, I know a little of what I speak. But there is a perception from the outside that all activity in the Palestinian territories, and to a certain extent in Israel at the moment, is this kind of binary position. How does that impact on you, that perception, working in Ramallah, within and outside of your institution and the territory that you live in?
Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Monica. And I would like to add something to what she was saying about freedom of speech and freedom of expression, freedom of listening, freedom of keep silent sometimes, as sometimes it's more needed than start talking. I come from, as you know, Palestine is a state which is well known with this historical conflict over there, which we hope it will come to an end, because it's a need not only for the people who are living there, it's, I think, there's a global need to solve such issue, to start thinking in other things. When it comes to think about freedom of speech in the region, it's raised up the question of politics rather than cultural issues, since it's a very political issue, the freedom of being alive first, then freedom of speech, then freedom of expression. What people are facing now time in Palestine and in other areas, it's not only thinking about this issue in their local situation, it's about thinking about this issue in a wider context. We are witnessing now kind of a big change in politics. The way we used to know 100 years ago. We kind of, in the era of facing a new order, a new kind of, as we were noticed in this summit, through the topics which was mentioned, like museum, heritage, technology, media and art, etc., there's kind of conflict everywhere in different issues. While this summit, it gives kind of hope that it raises the awareness of we need to listen to each others. We could use art as an opportunity to understand each other and to achieve kind of hope for the coming generation, not only in the war zone area, it should be everywhere. Of course, what we are facing there, it's not only because we don't have kind of direct incubation the same it was since 1967. After Oslo Agreement, there's kind of different challenging. We don't have a state yet, but we have two governments, unfortunately. We have two authorities. And artist has to work through these kind of tactics to find out solution, how to use in a very responsible way freedom of speech. And as, for example, my strategy as an artist is to use humor as much as possible to raise up these kind of questions.
I want to explore your humour in a minute. It's in your work. I think it's profound and funny. But it's very interesting that you raise the issue of that you have two governments, and therefore that power isn't just focused in one area. And I think that's a very interesting idea or fact to bring to the debate, because so often the feeling is that the creative communities and individuals are against the government or the state. But even that is a complicated and more nuanced situation. So who are you against? And the idea is that presumably you're against neither or both. You're obviously on one side of a particular cultural and political viewpoint, but you have to negotiate two positions and more.
The problem is to have two governments with no state.
Yes.
This is the problem.
It's even more complex, yeah.
Yes. So my concern is, I don't know even if this is my main concern is to have a state or not, because it's not the question of having the state. But the thing is, it's like we have one government in Gaza, as you know, and we have one government in the West Bank. And but also we have different authorities among these two governments. It's and the main issue for the Palestinian is they're resistant against the occupation. This is the main, and they want to come to a solution where to find their state first, and to then have their own freedom to rethink about the state issues, to rethink about government issues, stuff like this. And it's not, we know exactly that we don't want to be under occupation, but we don't know yet what kind of state we are looking for later on.
It's two very interesting positions. I mean, I'm sure there's overlap, but Monica's idea of actually things starting, not microcosmically, but in the home. There's a kind of rhizomatic thing that is coming through this conference about not just structures from on high, but how things can be incubated and sort of coalesce or cohere from different sources. Museums, however much we try to change, and we are changing, we're still an institutional authority that somehow makes selections as to what we show and how we show it. I don't particularly want to polarize your perspective from the change of government in Brazil, but it is interesting that there has been a change of government. Has it in any way, or has it fundamentally changed the way that you will operate in a museum. I mean, your museum was burnt down, but, how has political change or the structures of power impacted, and how does what Monica was talking about resonate with you as a museum director?
Yeah. Before I answer this question, I mean that you just pointed out, I feel it's such interesting freedom of expression. It's just it can be tackled by very different angles. It has so many different points that you can raise. And one point I think, and which somehow will encounter your question, is responsibility. You have freedom of expression, but you also has to be accountable for.
What to do with the freedom?
But who has to be accountable for? So if I may not, it's a very long story, but I'll make it very short. I think, in my opinion, artists, they have to be fully free. They have to be able to produce their art, which sometimes is going to annoy us, so which sometimes is going to lead to protest. We don't like it, we don't enjoy it. It kind of puts us out of our comfort zone. But then comes institutions like museum, and they have ultimately the responsibility what they're going to show. And they have to have many things into consideration. Their public and their mission, is it really good to have it right now? And please don't make confusion with if you will have a lot of people inside the museum. Sometimes you have to have exposition which you know are not that appealing, but you have to give a voice to certain areas. So I always defend that museums are not for profit in general. So because otherwise you're going to only have this exposition that they will attract people. So in that sense, I will just share with you a story that happened with our museum. At some point, I wasn't a director, by the way. We had an exhibit of art. You could have an exhibit of natural history art or something like that, but they were essentially new drawings. And, well, there comes the point. Was that appropriate in that context of a natural history museum? So if I go with my child, do I really want to show this to him? Or do I have to advise him what he's going to see? And you can expand that. Talking about my government, wow. You really want to get me into trouble, don't you?
I want to give you the space to decide whether you want to get yourself into trouble or not.
Look, there's something I can tell you. Freedom of speech, we have it. I can say whatever I want, but of course, then I will be accountable for it. But not because I've said something that is being disliked, at least in my government, at least in Brazil. I've been in other places, and I mean, I could, perhaps I will go back to that. I could share stories where I had scientists, and we were just talking, and there was one scientist watching out what the other scientist is doing for political reasons, which is very sad. I remember that one time when I was invited for lunch, and there was this wonderful lunch there, and I just took my camera. Oh, I want to take a picture, and there was the wife of this person without the hijab, and she just disappeared from the table like I was using a machine gun. I was so embarrassed by that, you know. But anyway, coming back to my government, we are scared. Culture, science, we are scared because there is a lack of funding that's just going down, down, down. But we're able to say so, to scream, to get to the press, to show all the things that can happen to that. Yeah. But it's still, we are not being very successful on that. This is why, by the way, sorry, I have to do that. Please send me those letters.
Okay, we will. Interesting, one or two of the examples you give, you raise the issue of cultural sensitivity and the idea of being aware, which I think relates to Monica's point about listening more broadly. Monica, when you have encountered situations where your work has come up against either legal or cultural barriers, how have you negotiated that? It's interesting to hear, pragmatically or ideologically, how you've negotiated it.
It's happened to us both as artists, and it's happened to us as curators. As artists, I think it was actually with the Imperial War Museum when it was a question of how certain archival material could be transformed or changed. And then the question also was whether we had the right to do that or not. And I think this question of right becomes the complicated issue, because when it's something like the archives, it is a custodianship that has to be negotiated every time. So you have to make an argument, which, you know, and when you're making an argument, you will use anything, including the fact that as a post-colonial, you have the right to your own history. But I do not blame them for wanting to be careful about. So I think this question of, like what you were saying, the freedom of negotiation is the primary sort of question that is being played out. In the context, say, of curating the Shanghai Biennial, which becomes a much more obvious kind of scenario, see, it's very interesting. When you have explicit rules, everything is much easier. You are not permitted to do X. You know that, then you figure out ways around it. So you work with artists, you figure out what do they want to say and how are they saying it, and you know, that conversation you do so that you are finding a mode of talking to the public and not to the state. This was one way that we were using when we were talking with artists. If you want to talk about something, let's figure out a way in which you are making a conversation with the public who's going to come to see your work, rather than speaking truth to power in a specific way in the terms that the state has set for you. In this instance, the state, which is the government of China, in specific terms, then you're going to have, you know, because that is not about topics A and B, it's not permitted. But what is really interesting is, at the end of it, the only film, the only piece of work that we couldn't actually show was a piece of work that was already available online. It's by Forensic Architecture, looking at the lifeboat incident that was of this lifeboat leaving from Tripoli, trying to get to Italy. And actually, it's a long and terrible tragedy in which people all died. And we couldn't understand why that was not permitted. And interestingly, it was not permitted because it was much more the question of, will our allies, the European countries, get upset that their moral standards were being put into question? So I think it's very interesting that when it finally came down to something that could not be negotiated, it had nothing to do with the instance that we were in. And I think this is where the question of negotiation also is one of specific instances, how you talk, whom you talk. Do you think that the state is the final repository, or is it society, and how you find ways? And I think this is the whole point of, or the joy of being an artist, is that when you unsettle, you can choose also the terms you are both unsettling and the terms you are using to unsettle things.
Khaled.
And sometimes it's there's a freedom of expression, not out of a law or out of agreement, out of negotiation, etc. It's out of chaos. There's sometime during catastrophe time or war time, it gives, when the state is not that much there, it gives the authority to everybody to start saying things. And there's a difference between freedom of speech as something protected by law or something there because of the lack of law.
Let's look at, I mean, you mentioned humour, and I mean, humour oughtn't to generate offence, but of course it has done in various instances in the last few years around the world, and one person's humour is another person's offence. But the idea that we live in various cultures where people are very, very quick to take offence is something that a lot of commentators have commented on. I don't know whether you think it's true or not, but it certainly seems to be an observed phenomenon. Just talk us through the Picasso in Palestine project you did in that regard, people's response, and actually and how you used profundity, loans, cultural negotiation, and humour in a project.
Yes, thank you for this question. It could be a good example for such discussion. In 2009 and between 2009 and 2011, I was working in a project called Picasso in Palestine, which is about bringing a Picasso work to be exhibited in Ramallah for the first time in history, which we managed to do. And this was about the story of how to bring Picasso from a European museum to be exhibited in a war zone. and to come through checkpoints, through military situation, unstable kind of life. And it was about negotiating with the insurance company, transportation company, beside the museum, and with the authority, of course, how to protect the artwork during it was exhibited in Ramallah for 1 month. And for me, it was a learning process. And I was happy yesterday when I saw Picasso in Abu Dhabi Louvre, which was more closer to get the work from Abu Dhabi to Ramallah than getting it from Eindhoven, from the Van Abe Museum in Netherlands. And the way how the artwork is keep going after Picasso goes back safely home in 2011, which I would like to show you some images. It also gave kind of more hope to such a project, how it could continue, and how it could be presented in different time. If I have the slide, I'm going to show you 4 images of the project, which could give you an idea how the project is. This is the first day the artwork arrived from the museum. The work was protected in this box, and as you can see, the out of no decoration, the policeman with the gun, with the protector of the artwork was in the same image.
I just want to say, for those of you who aren't in museums, that we're not made to kneel in veneration when works arrive. It's actually, we have to check them. And so this is condition checking with a special torch.
And there's some images became like a very well-known images by media and stuff. And this image, how the guards keep standing according to the... by the way, we did not have a museum at that time in Palestine, which we have 3 museums now. And this was we built up a 4x4 museum to host the painting for 1 month, which is humidity, temperature, security-wise, it was protected. And this image was one of the images that the people who come to visit the exhibition of one artwork to see this 2 policemen standing next to the work all the time. And this image was one of the main images used in the media by news, etc. And it was taken from a window. What I did whenever I invited to show the work in biennales, in museums, exhibition everywhere, I choose this image, and the idea was to ask more guards to protect the work I sent.
So this is your work based on the project Bringing the Picasso.
Yes.
This photograph is the beginning of your work, yeah.
And you can see Picasso is still there, and the guards is protecting it. And now it's exhibited in Muri Museum in Tokyo.
Yes.
And this is the image, as you can see. I don't know if it's 7 layers of guards, while the artwork is disappearing as much as there's guards. And this image is now exhibited also in Toulouse. And by the end of the exhibition, there will be 2 French guards protecting the guards from Japan. Thank you.
Alexander, it's a brilliant piece. I mean, I know you're taking with it. You want to stage it, but the idea that we almost...
I want him to take it to Brazil.
Yes, you should. You should.
Here's a positive outcome already, yeah. And respond.
Yeah. No, the interesting thing is you're already creating a new art. Provocative, isn't it? I mean, you can see, I mean, the impression to me was like that. The art is disappearing and the only policemen are now important. Yeah, but that's great.
But
That's great.
it's not only about the artwork, it's about the uniform, about the police, how they are standing, and they are part of the museum's things.
Yes.
And as also the message which I feel about it, I was talking to you outside that it could be nice to send the work to India to be shown with Indian guards. For me, it has a message that Indian also are protecting the Picasso in Palestine project, the same like Zimbabwe, the same like. So it's a very, it's a magical way how art could achieve something across borders, and I like the idea of the guards being protected by other guards, etc.
Yeah, and protecting our right to see an extraordinary object, but then layers and layers seemingly of authority distancing us from the object, but at the same time
And there will be
protecting.
no end.
Yeah, no, it's an infinite piece, so I think it has more global possibilities. Monica, you mentioned earlier right, or rights, in inverted commas, and Khaled's piece, among many things, brings one cultural discourse or a kind of icon, a much overused word, but I think it was framing the Picasso as an icon, to another culture or to another context, and then playing with it to a certain extent. Cultural ownership, though, in regards to the broader discussion about freedom of expression, is a very complex issue. I mean, there was somebody made the statement yesterday, a first world nation view that we must respect. That without us, nothing without us. We want to be part of the way that our history is shown and displayed. And there was a recent case in Britain involving a Fijian artist, Luke Willis Thompson, who caused a huge furore, even though he was working with the poor woman whose husband was shot by a policeman in America, the idea was that he had no right to that story or that history. How do you feel about the vexed issue of cultural ownership? Is it too polarized?
This is a complicated one, isn't it? Because the question of, well, is it my story or is it a human story? Can only I speak of it because I've experienced it, or can someone else speak about it? Can I take Picasso from Palestine to India, and does it become your story still, or does it become about power the way it plays out here? But I think in a way, the question is always not only what you say, but how you say it, right? I think this is the nuance that seems to become, I mean, it's like when people say, oh, in the old days, human beings survived because they either hunted, or they either were hunters or they were being hunted. The fact of the matter is they were also gatherers. They were also nurturers. This is as much a story of human life as much as it is of hunting, which is a much more glamorous story. So often I think in this question of what is the story being told, it becomes so much about what is being said. But I think if one pays attention to how it's being said, then it's possible for it to be spoken of in multiple ways. And then, like the guards from Zimbabwe and the guards from, there's no difference in the guards, really. The question is who's protecting what, and whom are we paying attention to? Obviously, at some point, we've stopped paying attention to the Picasso that has become the cat we don't know if it's alive or dead. All we know is that there's going to be always another skin of guards. I think this is what it's become. I think his artwork actually points to that conundrum.
Yeah, if you allow me to jump on that, I think the point here is everyone should have the right to talk about everything. The problem is when you impersonate the guys that have been victimized or their story. So I can, if you have it in Brazil, I can talk about it. Why not? That's freedom of speech, or if you wish. But I cannot say it from your angle. I can only say it from my angle. So I have to respect. I think it's all has to do with respecting the person that you're talking. I think that's very important. That's the key, I think.
Yes, and I think it gives, whenever an artist starts working in a project, many perspective is there. Not only he could not start working in a project from the perspective of freedom of speech or freedom of movement, etc. Many issues come into his mind. And sometimes one of the main things that whenever you have the platform to say something, to share something with others, it should raise up in your mind the question of responsibility and how to use this magic of art, how to use this when people like or ready to listen to you, how to be responsible to say something nice to them. And when it comes to my mind, the idea of freedom of expression, I don't think of as if it's something positive all the time, because something has been said in the time we are living in by fascist movement, by crazy military groups all around. What we consider this, is it a freedom of speech?
Yeah, but there's the accountability. You are responsible for what you say, and you
Yes.
have to be made accountable. And I think that also for the press, by the way. I have many stories that I could share with you guys where it's just blatantly wrong what they say, and then at some point they just put a small note 2 weeks later, oh, by the way, we were wrong, kind of. So it's accountability. But I really think from the artist's point of view, and I'm not an artist, by the way, from the artist's point of view, which I think is you should have the freedom as you want. Then it's the responsibility of the others, museums, or who is going to share your work.
Yes.
Do you,
I just wanted to talk also about the question of, when we're talking about freedom on speaking on behalf of it, often it's in terms of the past, right? This is what has happened, so we're going to render it to the question of how the narrative is told, that becomes. But I think it's interesting that now we're faced with the question of the future. So the question of the future is that we don't know, like the world is heading, let's say, at least in this insane climate terms, right? It's turning into a world that we will not recognize soon enough. And so who has the right to speak of that future? So when we have a 15-year-old child who has gone on, so children are striking in school and they are speaking on behalf of the future, they are being told that they are not really, they don't have the expertise to speak about it. And I think this question of who is speaking and who has the true, it may not be their responsibility because they're still children, but at the same time, it is their future. So when the question of who is mute, who is the voiceless, and what permission is given and what permission is taken, I think this also has to be added into this mix of, rather than just of accountability to power in that way.
But back to the question of right of listening, we should listen more to the new generation, to the new language. I will say in Palestine, for example, now, and I think it's all over, there's a new generation who have their own statement and they want to have the platform. So the old generation, which is me and maybe older, they should listen and they should give the space for these voices to be there. They should give them the stage.
But I think the reason it causes also anxiety is because it makes the expertise of experts valueless, if you know what I mean. This is the problem when the question of speech or expression creates anxiety. It's not so much what is being said, but what is it destabilizing. And I think that is the point that artists work towards, right? The unsettling of expectations. So that's not so much a question of responsibility, I think. The question of responsibility that you began with is, it's not that artists are irresponsible in a way that you were sort of pushing us towards thinking, but it's also, I think, the question of, if you're going to unsettle things, you do not always know what's going to come out of it, but there are going to be people who are going to feel leached of power or shaken of power.
it was my ineloquence. I didn't mean to imply irresponsible, but they had different or other responsibilities or not. Now, we've talked about listening. Let's listen. Let's take questions from the floor. At the risk of trying to close you down before you've started, could you keep your questions or observations brief so we might get one or two? But other questions from the floor.
Also with a quick question, and I think it seems you touched on strategies and who's listening and sort of the how. So it seems that artists need to have the skills to sort of persuade, so the art of persuasion, in order to get the listeners to be effective. Just comment on that if you have.
Yeah, in order, if you want someone to listen, you have something to say.
Yes.
And the way, and there are different ways to say it, particularly in the new world. And I totally agree with your comment. We need to listen to those guys because it's their future. Even if they say something we don't like, maybe we need to be confronted with that.
I think that if having something to say, but saying it in a way that's engaging, is one of the essences of art, isn't it? I mean, many human beings have things to say. It's actually trying to be compelling and engaging in the way that we say it, or nuanced.
It's not only about saying, it's a package.
Yeah.
There's something else needed when we are talking about the new generation. To give them the platform, they need the possibility to say what? For art creation, for example, we need an institution who will respect their needs, who will answer their questions, who will support them to do such things. It's not only to give them the stage without tools. They need the tools to do so.
Thank you. Yeah. Question from the floor.
السلام عليكم. أنا سعيدة باللي سمعت اليوم عن الحرية الفكرية وحرية الرأي. وأعتقد أستاذ خالد كثير حبيت نقاشك أن الحرية تختلف من مكان لمكان. وأعتقد أن دولة فلسطين في حاجة أن تكون لها مساحة الحرية أكبر من مساحة الدول الثانية. مثلا لو أقارن بدولة الإمارات العربية المتحدة، الحرية مسؤولية، يعني كل إنسان يعبر على حسب أنه ما يخلق فوضى. في بعض الحريات تخلق فوضى في المجتمع ويخلق فيها مشاكل أكثر ما هي تنفع المجتمعات. طبعا مثل هذا المؤتمر وقمة ثقافية، أشكر دائرة أبو ظبي للثقافة والسياحة على إتاحة الفرصة لنا أن نقعد في نقاشات ثقافية فكرية حرة في التعبير عن ذاتنا بخارج عن النطاق السياسي اللي دائما يصير في خلاف بين الثقافة وبين السياسة. مثل ما المحاضرة اللي قبل كانت عن اليونسكو وحماية التراث، واللي قبلها عن الصحافة. أعتقد مثل هالمنابر هي اللي تخلق نوع من التوحد، نوع من الفهم الآخر، نوع من الانطلاق يعني لفكر الآخرين واحترام الآخر. صحيح. عشان كذي أعتقد أن اليوم ثانك يو أن الأخ تكلم أن الحرية مسؤولية، وهذا كله إن شاء الله أنه يكون وجودكم بأبو ظبي، وأهلا وسهلا فيكم، شرفتونا يعني.
والثقافة بتجمع، هذا إشي صحيح 100%.
مشكورين يعني ما قصرنا.
Culture is bring us together.
Yes.
Culture and art, of course.
Could we have is there a question there?
The culture, it's bring people more together.
Yes. Okay.
Thank you. أنا أجاوبك بالعربي أو بالإنجليزي؟
كيف على بالإنجليزي؟
أنا عربياتي أحسن زي ما أنت شايف. أحسن بالعربي. I will say something in Arabic. I think it's like we're saying. زي ما قلت بالعربي أنت، أنا بفكر إنه الثقافة إشي بيجمع الناس وبتبني جسور أكثر من ما بتبني جدران، وهذا المفروض فيها تعمل. والتنوع الثقافي هو سر الجمال اللي في هذه الحياة. وقد ما بنكتشف هذا الشيء بنكتشف الخسائر اللي بتترتب على الإنسان لما يحرم من الثقافة. هالمنصة اللي أتاحتها قمة أبو ظبي الثقافية لأنه نستمع من شرق الأرض وغربها، من شمالها وجنوبها، لقضايا ثقافية متعددة، بصراحة هي وسعت مدارك الإنسان حول هموم بلده، مش بس حول البلد اللي بنسمع فيها. كل حوار كان مفيد للآخر بطريقة أو بأخرى، وبالذات إنه الواحد في العالم اللي فيه صعوبات بحسش حاله وحيد.
Yeah, and if I might like to add to that,
Please.
I think you already said it. Culture brings people together. Think about the world in the future. If I will go to Palestine, I would like to appreciate the culture from there. If I go to India, wherever I go. And culture brings people together, and culture is a way to break walls. Without violence, by the way.
Of course.
Another question. Thank you.
Hi, thank you for this wonderful conversation. I noticed that we're all sharing the same definition pretty much of freedom of expression, or its subsets, as you put it. I feel like that was coined and defined within the history of cultures that are far away from mine. And sometimes it's that lens that's used to assess the level of freedom, and sometimes even unjustly criticize what is seen at this upper crust, whether through formal communications or mainstream media, But if we look deeper into the level of society and what's a buzz there, there is a very powerful but informal social contract that everyone has, a lot of the majority have signed into. Of course, there's a few outliers with some aspects, myself included, and it's normal. But if we were to redefine, and this is my question, if we were to define this concept so it suits other cultural contexts, how would the social contract factor or come into play?
Can we squeeze in that last question together, perhaps?
Okay. Really? I thought it's a very complicated question that deserves a complicated answer, but thank you. Okay, I will bow to the floor. Yeah, next one.
No, I think it relates to the other two questions, and this is also what Monica said, is freedom of speech and freedom of listening is one thing, but can we also allow in our societies, again, a space of antagonism, a space for dissents, in order to negotiate and to have this conversation, and not just in harmony. I mean, we have different cultures, different concepts, and where I see is a problem that we cannot have this space anymore. And I think, can we maybe negotiate dead spaces?
You're quite right. They're aligned beautifully. Monica.
I'm not entirely sure if I understand what you mean by like outside, because I think the question of freedom of listening partly to me was this place of and not consensus but dissensus, right? That you can actually formulate an elastic social contract. I think the social contract is given, but at the same time it's always being constructed, and that's why I was referring to the idea of the home as a starting position. Obviously, the generations, say in my context, generation before that, women, say, for example, have been on the streets asking for the right to vote, and it keeps changing. So now it is another kind of which is why questions of Me Too in one context, or how we can have conversations in public in another way, which is why I give the example of the Chiapas movement, where you talk about the habit of being equal. You use that as opposed to a law which is neither natural nor given to you. It comes out of practice, and I think this is the question of the practice of dissensus, the practice of being able to reformulate differently. And I think this is where the practice of being woman also is part of that, and quite at the frontier of it, if I may say so.
I think the idea of a space for antagonism is critical, but it goes back to Alexander's point about respect and listening, that it doesn't become a kind of polarized, reductive, ignorant debate where no one's listening to the other side and we're locked into a sort of interminable debate, says a man from Britain at the moment. But surely the idea, it doesn't fly in the face of what you've been saying, does it? The idea of respectful antagonism or spaces to actually hear people's positions and violently, or rather vehemently disagree with them.
Well, I can just tell you, whenever we have our meetings in Brazil, depending, it doesn't matter what, we like to hear and to listen to different opinions and to different ways of solutions. They're really interesting. It doesn't mean that we might take number one, number two, but it's important to listen. But in order to listen, we need to have people that have something to say. And I will just stress this because I thought your intervention was great. I want to listen to the young guys. We are now rebuilding a museum. I want to listen to the kids. What do they want? We have received so many letters of their interpretation of how the museum should be. For example, just giving the example of the museum because that's the area I work in. So listen, and particularly to the new generation. That's a challenge for us, and I think we should tackle it somehow.
Okay, on which note, we have to end, space has run out. But one of the points about a summit like this is that we can listen to each other in other contexts. So this is a discussion that will continue, certainly should continue over lunch, and maybe we'll start to inform ways that the conference, or the summit rather, takes various ideas or action points forward. But can I thank you all for your nuanced and complex and sensitive debate, and thank you to the three panelists. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tim. Fantastic.